Hi Dave, this is the pre-recording of your 6 Wine Stories show for the YPO on the 9th of December. I've actually called it Wine Stories because there's only 5 wines and not 6. So here's the presentation. So it starts off by me saying a little introduction to myself. This is me. I'm Robert Hunter. I've worked in the wine industry here in Spain, living in the north of Spain here in Catalonia for the last 36 years. My goodness, how time flies. Anyway, and I've worked in the wine industry for most of that time. And obviously, when you work in the wine industry, you tend to talk about very technical things, and you talk about fermentation and grape varieties and types of pruning, and a lot of different technical things which most wine people or people who drink wine aren't really interested in. So when I visited this place here, this is a cooperative which was built in the 1920s in a big boom of modernist architecture that was built at the time by disciples of Gaudí. And they built several of these buildings down in a region in the south of Catalonia called the Terralta. And they were functional, they were made as places to make wine, but they also were very decorative, as you can see from the design. And if you look closely at that line of tiles just above the doorway, below the main windows, you can see there are little scenes about wine. And one of them, which I really loved, was this one here, which shows 6 guys doing what wine is made for. In other words, they're sitting around, they're having a drink, and they're telling stories. And the funny thing is that they're hunters, and I am Robert Hunter, so it perfectly fits with the whole theme of what I want to talk about, which is that wine is for telling stories. People sit around, they chat. Wine is a social lubricant, and they want to tell stories about people, about events, about history, about places. They're not really that interested in how the wine is actually made itself. So that's going to be our main focus this evening, is to talk about where the wines come from, who they make them, why they make them, and then maybe we'll talk about the wine itself at the end, but maybe not. Anyway, we're going to start off by having a quick look at where the wines all come from. The main arc of narrative of the evening is the geography of this big peninsula we call the Iberian Peninsula. Wine is made all over the place. All of those areas which are shaded there are winemaking regions. So you can see there's a large part of the country which makes wine. And as you might imagine, there are different types of wine made in different places. It's a little bit difficult to tell you the geography of a country just by showing it you on a map. So I'm going to make it a little bit easier by using a couple of props, very simple props to show you the geography of Spain. Here's a plate. So it's great when you're sitting down at the table. You can have a dinner plate, knife and fork, a serviette, and we're going to use that to show you the geography of Spain by turning the plate over and putting it on its face, laying it down on the table. That is very simply pretty much the geography of Spain. In other words, it's a fairly circular sort of country with a round, flat plateau in the middle, surrounded by this ring of hills. And in actual fact, if I lift it up a little bit and add on this little bit on the side here, we'll see that it's lifted up towards the left so that most of the rivers will flow out towards the Atlantic, towards Portugal. But you also have this little bit here on the side, which is Catalonia, which is where we are now. And that's where we're going to start our journey. We're going to start it close to home in the Mediterranean region. This is where we start, the Mediterranean. Here's the Mediterranean. Beautiful sea, great for tourists, great for coming to visit. Lots of beautiful areas, beautiful beaches, And when you go inland a little bit, you come to places like the Penedès. The Penedès is just, I say it's south of Barcelona. It's not really south at all. It's very much to the southwest, almost due west of Barcelona, because the coast at this point runs almost east to west. And the Penedès is only about 50 kilometers from Barcelona. And there you can see it on the inland. At the northern end, you've got the mountain of Montserrat, which divides us from the north. And then as we're looking at this photograph, the sea is actually about 10 kilometers to the right, as we're looking at it here. So you've got this inland depression. It's not really a valley, it's a depression. And it's very close to Barcelona. So you've got a very Mediterranean climate, which means very mild, warm in the summer. Of course, for people who come from the north of Europe, it feels hot. But compared to the rest of Spain, it's not that hot. It's warm. It has very mild winters. So here you grow crops, or the grapes which are grown are grapes which can grow with a very long growing period. The Mediterranean area is quite dry. It doesn't rain too much, but when it does rain, it can rain really torrentially. Okay, so the people who live here. The people who live here have lived here for a very long time. This is Maite Esteva, her family, and the four families that make up her company. Her company is called Vins El Cep, and they are four families who own farmhouses in the Penedès, in a very small area. They're actually neighbours originally, very close neighbours, and they got together and started a company in 1980. They started a company in 1980, but they've been neighbours since, well, probably the early Middle Ages. Let's say they could well go back to the 10th or 11th century, although none of that is actually documented until the 15th century. In the 15th and 16th century, all their houses are documented since the 15th and 16th century. There's a very long reason for that. If anybody isn't really into medieval history, I can tell you about that, but it just goes to say that these people have been farmers, farming mostly grapes, but also other crops for many, many centuries. And now they make a series of wines and cavas from their own grapes. Cava is the Spanish equivalent of champagne. In other words, it's a sparkling wine which is made by having a second fermentation in the bottle, and it's a very popular way of making wine here. It's not the only sort of wine people make, but it's one of the most popular. This is the area where they grow. This is a photograph taken just the other day in this autumn. The hills there really are dividing the Penedès from the sea, so it's very close to the Mediterranean. And even at this time of year, it's not. Obviously, it's cold. It's autumn, but it's not very, very cold. It's a very pleasant sort of climate here. And this is one of Maite's vineyards. And then once they've grown the grapes, then they'll bring them back to one of their farmhouses. Of the four farmhouses that the family owned, or the four families, each of which owned their own farmhouse, they chose one of them to be the place where they would make their wines and make their cava. Cava is a product which is not only a process of making wine, so first wine is made from grapes, but once they've made the wine, they take it into the cellar. So it goes down in the cellar, in bottles, and it's aged in bottles for a period of time. That period of time really depends how you want the cava to taste. The minimum period is 9 months, and it'll age like that with the yeast still inside the bottle for a period before it's degorged. This is one of the old degorging machinery when they still did it very much by hand to make a typical Catalan sparkling wine called Cava. And then, and this is a Blanc de Nice is made from Pinot Noir, which is not a traditional grape variety in the Penedès, but Maite's brother had studied in California and understood that Pinot Noir could make a very, very good sparkling wine as well as making good red wine. So they planted it in the early 90s when he came home from university. So that's the first wine, first story. Then we're going to go back to our diagram here. We're going to go all the way across to the other side of the country. So we're not in the center of the country, we're right out now on the Atlantic coast. So this second story is about wines from the Atlantic. Here we have the Atlantic, a very, very different feel to the Mediterranean. It's a big ocean, a cold ocean, and most of the weather in Spain comes from the Atlantic. So all the weather fronts are generally coming from the Atlantic and moving across Spain from left to right. If you look at it that way, they're coming from the west towards the east. And so Galicia, which is the part of Spain which is on the Atlantic coast above Portugal, has a very different climate and therefore also a very different culture to other parts of Spain. This is the area we're talking about. Specifically, this wine comes from the river Minho. So the Minho is, our map here doesn't show us Portugal, but the Minho is the river which divides Spain from Portugal at this point. It's actually the border. And this particular vineyard lies on the northern side of the Valley Minho. If it was on the southern side, it'd be in Portugal. But as you can imagine, the climate wouldn't change very much. This is a little bit further down to the coast, so you can see here how the estates look. You'll see immediately from this photograph how different it looks from the Mediterranean that we saw before, and that's not only to do with climate and geography, but also to do with historical tradition. In Catalonia, estates like Maite's estate have been maintained in the family because the tradition, the civil law defined that all estates would be maintained as one. So they're inherited as one piece. They're never broken up between the children. They're always inherited historically by the eldest son, who's called the hereu, and he would keep the estate in one piece and make it bigger if he could, but always the estate would be inherited as one sole piece. In large parts of the rest of Spain, and particularly in Galicia, all the land was divided up between the children. So if you had 8 children, that meant dividing your land in 8 pieces. And that meant that the pieces became smaller and smaller and smaller, so that nowadays people end up having very small pieces of vineyard. And so somebody like Antonio, who runs his winery in the town of Asneves, he has to deal with literally hundreds of small grape growers who are all bringing in different types of grape, but mostly Albariño, which is the grape which has become the most famous one. And in this particular vintage, this year, this is 2022, when I took this photograph, and it was a very dry year, so Antonio has real problems trying to work out how he can make enough wine, because it was a very dry vintage, so all the grapes were very, very small, and it meant about 20% less wine. Here you can see a typical estate in Galicia, in what's called the Rías Baixas, or the lower estuaries of Galicia. It's an estate where people have very small bits of land. In the middle, so on the right-hand side of this photograph, you can see corn. So they've grown corn in the center of the field, and all around the edge of the field, they have this one narrow strip of land which is for grapes, and they grow the grapes up off the floor. You can see as well the different climate here, the fact that it's all green because it's been raining. So to avoid fungal diseases, especially mildew and then rot in around harvest time, they keep the grapes well off the ground. You can see here how far off the ground that is. That's the grapes are above head height, so it's always a tough task at harvest time. You don't need to bend down. That's the problem people have here in the rest of Spain, is that if you're picking by hand, you have to spend all day bending down, so you get really bad backache. In Galicia, they don't have backache; they have shoulder ache. They have to a neck ache, because they have to spend all day with their hands above their heads cutting off grapes. It's equally tough. This is the Albariño grape. So it's a tiny little grape. It's not the sort of grape you'll find in a supermarket. Wine grapes are always smaller than table grapes, and they contain a lot more juice and a lot less flesh. But Albariño is particularly small, and then this is a 2022 grape. This is a tiny grape this year. Perfectly healthy because it was very, very dry, so there was no problems with rot or disease, but just really tiny grapes to produce quite intense flavors. This is the Manuel de Amaro wine that Antonio produces. That wasn't Antonio's hand, by the way. That was Natalia, who works with Antonio. She was showing me the grapes. Antonio makes Albariño. He also makes different sorts of grape varieties like Laureiro and Trechadura, but this is 100% Albariño. And this one has been aged on the lees, so it has a bit more weight and a bit more power. Some Albariños are very fresh, quite saline, very good for shellfish, for oysters, for fresh mussels. This one is a bit weightier for more complex dishes. Now we're going to move back to the Mediterranean a little bit, but we're not specifically thinking about the Mediterranean as such. We're thinking about the river that flows across the top of Spain. There's one river that doesn't flow from east to west, that doesn't go out into the Atlantic, which most of the big rivers do in Spain. There's one big river that comes the other way, because it's come from the mountains in the north of Spain and it flows into the Mediterranean. And this is the river Ebro. The river Ebro is a real wine river, like there are many, like the Rhine or the Rhone in France, or the Loire. A river where you can find wines grown almost along the whole of its length. Most famously, like this photograph is taken in a town called La Puebla de la Barca, which literally means the village of the boat, a crossing place on the River Ebro, and that is in Rioja. In the middle of Rioja, the River Ebro flows through Rioja, and Rioja is the most famous region within the Ebro Valley that makes wine. But there are many others as well in either closer to the river or in the general area of the river valley. So as you go further down, you pass through Navarra, you pass through Campo de Borja, Cariñena, you go close to Calatayud or Somontano, and you end up very close to the Mediterranean in the Priorat. Okay, and the Priorat is a very small region, now within Catalonia. So we've come across the whole of the north of Spain and ended up in close to the delta, just below the A there of Priorat. You can see the delta of the river Ebro, and the river doesn't flow through the Priorat. The Priorat sort of sits just north of the Ebro, but it's within about 4 kilometers at the closest point, and it's very much part of the ecosystem of the Ebro River. As you can see, it's a very mountainous area. It's like a little cauldron in some ways. Here we are looking towards the north and towards a place called the Monsanto, or place, a mountain range called the Monsant. Actually, beyond that mountain range, it's fairly flat. So it's not a series of peaks. It's just like a cliff edge. And beyond that, you have the flat center of Spain. If we were to turn right from this photograph, we'd see another ridge called the Serra de Albariño, which divides the Priorat from the Mediterranean Sea. But these two mountain ranges actually create a very, very unusual microclimate within the whole region of Catalonia, because it's an area where it rains very little, either because of one ridge or the other, or the rain tends to fall on the other side of the mountain. So you have this little cauldron in the middle with incredibly rocky soils, incredibly poor rocky soils, where very little grows. It's difficult to get to because of the mountains. So for many, many years, it was quite an abandoned place. Here we are. This photograph is actually taken from the other end of the Priorat, so at the very northern end. You can still see the Monsant to the right now, and we're looking south towards the River Ebro. The River Ebro, what you can see here, this water here is actually a small reservoir for the Siurana River, which will eventually run down into the Ebro, which is at this point about 25 kilometers away. So you can see a very rocky, very poor area, very difficult to get to. So for many years, after the 19th century, it became more and more abandoned. It was too difficult to get to, until it was, in some ways, rediscovered by people coming from the outside. The average age of the people who were living in the Priorat was getting older and older. There was no new blood coming in. But in the 1980s, it was people from America, from other parts of Spain, from Barcelona, from Rioja, and then people from all over who've come into the Priorat in the last 30 years and discovered an incredible heritage of old vines producing fantastic, tiny amounts of fantastic grapes. So Danilo is the guy who came in as one of those many people, came on a pilgrimage. It's called the Priorat because it belonged to the priory of Scala. So when the Christians reconquered this part of Spain, it was actually one of the later parts of Spain to be reconquered because it was so remote and so difficult to get to. The land was given to the church and belonged to the church for many, many centuries, until what's called the Desamortización de Mendizábal, which was the dissolution of all church property, which happened in Spain as late as the 19th century. So the church at that point owned about a quarter of all the land in Spain. It was worked by local farmers, of course, but the ownership was of the church. So it wasn't until the 19th century that the land became owned by the local people. But still today, the Priorat is a place of pilgrimage, but more for very keen, very serious winemakers who want to make top-level wines. And they come in, and you can say they form partnerships with local people who own the land, who grow the grapes to a large extent. So you have this symbiosis of new knowledge, new winemakers, relatively young people, a lot of them, coming in to make fantastic wines with the fantastic grapes, which is a bit the hidden treasure of the Priorat. This wine is called Costerduo, and Coste is what you can see in the photograph. You can actually see the two ways of growing grapes here on this photograph. In the center, you have this, what appears to be a flat piece of land, but it's not flat at all. It's actually quite a steep slope. And above that, even steeper, it has to be terraced. So the two ways of growing are on terrace or on what is called coste. Coste is this slope. And all of this land, these 9 villages which form the Priorat, they all have slate. The soil is pure slate. If you can call it soil, it looks incredibly rocky. on the surface, and in fact it's rocky all the way down. The key to the vines surviving is that they can have incredibly deep roots, which push all the way down into the the soil, into the rock, into the cracks in the rock, and find moisture, and also that the depth of the soil. The roots can go down 20 meters quite easily. The depth of the soil provides cooler temperature as well as moisture, and allows the vines to produce grapes even in years which apparently it would seem impossible because of the heat, because of the low rainfall in the Priorat, but it's all held in the subsoil. And that subsoil then produces these small bunches of grapes to make intense wines. The Costerduo, so the duo has two sides to it, as well as the different types of cultivation. It also has two types of grape. One is Cariñena and the other is Garnacha. Now we're going to go back to the center of Spain. Finally, we're going to go into that that area, which is the high plain. In actual fact, this particular wine it's not exactly, well, the high plain sort of shifts over to the left. We tilt the plate, and as we tilt the plate, the river Duero runs off towards Portugal. And once it crosses the border into Portugal, it becomes the Douro River. And so at this point, there isn't actually a hill. We're just sort of gradually tilting towards the Atlantic Ocean. And here we'll come across, so we're in the center of Spain, where the famous windmills. So it's generally very flat, very high and very cold, and can be very windy, which is why you have there's nothing to stop the wind blowing across those plains. So it's the famous windmills from the center of Spain. But we're going to go now to a little bit more to the northwest, still on the flat area, but as you can see, getting closer to Portugal and starting to tilt off towards the Atlantic. And this is the town of Toro. The town of Toro is there right on that plain. It actually stands above, and the vineyards stand above. You can just about make out here on this photograph, below the church, which is the thing sticking up there in the middle. That's the, what's it called? I can't remember what it's called now. It has a special name. It's not just a church. So below that church, you have the valley of the river Duero. Before the Duero gets to Toro, or the town of Toro and the wine-growing area of Toro, it goes through an area called the Ribera del Duero. The Ribera just meaning the edge of the river, the sides of the river, the Ribera. And now we're in the region of Toro. This is the man who decided he wanted to make wine in Toro. He's originally from that area. He's from a tiny, tiny village called the village of Latarce. This is Eladio San Jose, his wife and daughter. And he's from this village called Latarce, which is a tiny village close by, but actually historically very well known because it had a huge castle. The north of the Duero River, on the northern side of the Duero River, was during the period of the Muslim invasions, was the frontier to the Muslim kingdoms which were in the south. And so the Christian kings built a lot of fortifications on the north, many of which were then virtually destroyed, like this one was, by Napoleon in the 19th century. That was another terrible thing that happened to the north of Spain. But this place still remains as the castle of Latarce, and this is where Eladio originally came from. Just a regular guy, poor guy, who started driving a truck and built up his own independent trucking business, and wanted to sort of reinvest back into his the traditional wine growing of the Toro region. On this photograph, you can see a sort of typical area. We're going down towards the Duero River on this photograph. And on the right-hand side, in the mountainside, you can see hundreds and hundreds of cellars that were built. And those were built in the 18th and 19th centuries because that's where people would keep their wines. If you compare to France, you might imagine that in France they have chateaus and the people live in the chateau and they have their vineyards all around the chateau, and that's where they make their wine. Again, in Toro, like in Galicia, people had very small pieces of vineyard, and they didn't want to live on the land. They wanted to live in villages. It was safer, so they all lived in the town of Toro, which is very close by, and then they would come and farm their grapes and keep their wines in these little cellars. And there's like a whole community of cellars there, and so this is one of the traditions that Eladio wanted to revive. He started making his own wine in 2006, and gradually built it up until he could make his own winery in 2019. This is old vines. This is an area which is less famous than Ribera del Duero. Ribera del Duero became famous for a lot of reasons, which are perhaps too long to go into here. Toro was sort of left to one side, but that meant, as in the Priorat, it's an area where people haven't replaced the vines. The old vines have remained, and the old vines produce tiny amounts of really fantastic grapes. So this is what it looks like in the spring. So photos was taken in sort of May this year, beginning of May. I was there, and you can see it's been pruned back in the winter, and now at the beginning of spring it's going to start shooting again. And this is compared to the Mediterranean, where the growing season is very long and it's relatively easy. Here the growing season is quite short. You have to be very careful that you don't get frost at the beginning of spring, and then the grapes are ripening really well into the autumn. By October they have to be ripe. Often they're not ripe until the end of October, although that is now changing with climate change, of course. And there is Aman, finally, with his daughter and his first bottle of wine in his own winery in 2019. That's Latarce, made from Tinta de Toro. Tinta de Toro is a type of Tempranillo. It's genetically the same grape as Tempranillo. It speaks a different dialect. It's grown in a slightly different soil, with a slightly different climate, a little bit warmer, so it makes wines a little bit more powerful. Then finally, we're back to our plate, back to the edge of town, and now we're going to go all the way down to the southwest, and down to the southwest, Andalusia. This is the port at Cádiz. So again, we're Atlantic climate, but all of a sudden we're in a very, very different part of the world. You can see the structures here are not recent ones. This is not a modern winemaking area at all. This is historically the oldest winemaking area in Spain. Well, possibly grapes are grown all over Spain, but the port of Cádiz and the surrounding ports, like Port of Seville, Port of Santa Maria, are the places from where the Spanish sailed for South America as the most important trading port in Spain for many, many centuries. Since before the time that America was discovered, people were sailing into the Atlantic, and when they sailed into the Atlantic, they wanted to take sherry with them. Sherry is the name of the town, where it's called Jerez. It was anglicized into the word sherry very, very early on, so it's still known now as Jerez stroke sherry. And in Jerez, what they had was not so much farmers, but traders. If you go down to the town of Jerez, and particularly the Puerto de Santa Maria, you'll still find mile after mile after mile of old warehouse, and old sherry warehouses were full of alcoholic products, which is why they turn black on the outside. The black is the same if you go to cognac, places like that. A fungus grows which lives off the alcohol, which evaporates, and so the people who you meet in sherry, they're not wine growers. Wine is grown in the area between Sherry and San Luca de Barrameda on a very white, pale soil. Produces large quantities of fairly bland white wine, which then goes into cellars and is traded by gentlemen like these. This is Mr. Lustau, an old sherry trader back at the beginning of the century. It's an interesting photograph, but in actual fact, you could find documents of these people going all the way back to the 15th century, because that's how much sherry has been traded. At one point in history, the trade in sherry was 10% of all trade from Spain, not only going, of course, famously to the UK. I mean, even Shakespeare talks about sherry. But going all over the world, and it was a massive, massive, massive industry. To begin with, they were selling sherry, and then later on in the 17th, 18th century, they turned more to distilling wine and making brandy, which they would age, obviously, in barrels. But the barrels they already had, barrels was purely a container to begin with. But because these barrels were stored in very old warehouses, and the wine was kept for a very long time, what you'd see was that the wine would evaporate, and then a layer of fungus, of yeast, would grow on top, and that's called the flor, and now is the most important thing that actually gives flavor to sherry. There are lots of different types of sherry. It's a very complex issue to get into, because it's not just about the wine, it's about the blending and the aging and the flor. But suffice it to say that sherry is kept for a very long time, and you need to have a lot of warehouses, and this is where the history of wine in Spain really starts, the history of the trade. So you have, and this is one of the traditional ways of getting the wine out of the barrel to taste it, to make sure that it's okay. You might have heard of two types of sherry. One is called fino, one is called olorosa. They're basically the same type of wine, but for whatever reason they get different flavors. So fino just means fine, a refined wine, and olorosa means a bit smelly. So the fino is usually considered the better wine to begin with, although over time olorosa has become just as popular, if a little bit rarer. And to get through the flor, you need to break the flor first, and using this type of cane actually breaks through the flor and dips into the wine underneath, and then you can flick out the wine to taste it to make sure it's okay. This is a Pedro Jimenez, which is a very specific type of sherry. Most sherries are dry to begin with, so it's mostly as an aperitif. But for this evening, to finish off the meal, we've chosen a sweet Pedro Jimenez, which is grapes which have been dried before they're fermented, so they have an incredible amount of sugar, and then they're aged in the same as all the others in barrels for many, many, many years to really attain an incredible concentration and special nutty flavors. Okay, so that's the end of the wine stories. Hope you enjoyed it, and of course we can sit around and chat a little bit more about them later on.